Today we're going to be talking a little bit about knowledge gaps in the diving community. What we did in 2018 was we did a survey of professional divers to try to determine some of the common knowledge gaps that might exist in the community. And this was primarily done in Quebec, but it was an online survey, so it was actually opened up to people from around the world. We ended up having 431 participants. About 85% of them were male, and 93% of them self-reported as being active divers. So that was good. We were getting divers who were truly involved in the activity. So the distribution of divers in terms of nationality, we had about 60% from Canada, 25% from the US, and then the rest of the participants were from around the world. In terms of their level of engagement in diving, we had a large portion that reported being commercially involved, commercial divers, and then a fair number who were recreational professionals, so dive masters, instructors. What we were able to see in this study were a number of knowledge gap areas. Not everyone had them, but these were common patterns of misunderstanding or maybe incomplete understanding of the issues. And a lot of these were fairly fundamental areas. To give you an example, the physical fitness demands of diving weren't really understood. And so this is how hard divers will normally work on a dive and whether or not diving represents physical training. Well, to answer those questions, a smart diver works as little as possible underwater. And so diving is not physical fitness training. If you want to be fit for diving, you have to do your training typically outside of the diving arena. That was the first point. Another thing that was sometimes misunderstood was when and how barotrauma might be likely to occur. Some people didn't realize that with a full lungful of gas in as shallow as 5 feet of water, surfacing could cause rupture of the lungs. And that was an important thing to understand. Another area that was a bit of a lapse was vertigo. Vertigo is not always that well understood. Vertigo is the transient dizziness and disorientation that can sometimes occur. Alternobaric vertigo is vertigo that develops when you have unequal pressures in the two middle ears. We commonly see this in diving, and what's interesting, what people don't always realize, is that you can develop those symptoms on the way down or on the way up. So you have to be very careful when you give divers advice. Some people want to give a direction they should travel to resolve the situation quickly. But that can be problematic because the problem can develop going in either direction. So the only good, sound, consistent advice you can give people when they develop vertigo underwater, they should hold their position as best they can until the symptoms pass. The nice thing about vertigo is that it's self-limiting. It will normally resolve in 5 to 15 seconds as the pressure differential between the two middle ears disappears. So if you can hold your depth long enough for the differential to disappear, symptoms go away, problem resolved. If divers recognize this, they can avoid the panic that can result when you're suddenly surprised by this extreme dizziness. And that's what's key to helping keep people safe. The next thing that people often didn't recognize fully was immersion pulmonary edema. We've known of immersion pulmonary edema in the scientific literature for more than 20 years. But the information hasn't really gone down to the diver level that effectively. We know that it's a multifactorial condition. A number of factors can increase the pulmonary artery pressure and they can increase the capillary stress and ultimately lead to fluid being introduced into the lung, which impairs gas exchange. We want to avoid anything that impairs gas exchange. And some of the things that can contribute to immersion pulmonary edema are things that the diver may do with an incomplete understanding, with a false impression of doing it for safety. To give you the best example, some people think that dehydration is a truly critical factor in decompression stress. It isn't. Dehydration can be a risk factor, but it's not the big factor. The big factor is your dive profile. So people who think they should drink as much as possible so they don't have to worry about DCS, are really not doing themselves a favor in terms of decompression sickness risk, and they're also increasing their susceptibility to immersion pulmonary edema, because hyperhydration is one of the risk factors for IPE. Other risk factors include cold water diving, tight wetsuits, increased work of breathing that you might get with high workloads. You've got a number of factors that work together, and that's probably why it's under-recognized, because it's not one thing that causes it. It's usually a large number of factors that contribute a little bit to it happening. So immersion pulmonary edema is something to pay attention to. Next thing the divers were a little bit unfamiliar with are some of the new limits for oxygen exposure. And it is becoming more and more the standard that the maximum PO2 that's recommended for the operational, the working phase of the dive, is 1.4 atmospheres absolute. Some organizations were allowing 1.6, but it's now recognized that we've seen enough cases of oxygen toxicity that have occurred at just less than 1.6 that it probably isn't good to stay there. And this makes sense, because if you're deep on a dive, the difference between 1.4 atmospheres of oxygen and 1.6 in terms of minimizing your inert gas uptake is actually trivial. So at depth, the higher PO2 doesn't help you very much. And while it can help you shallowly, when you're at the shallow points of the dive, you do have to be aware that you can still develop a seizure there. It is easier to rescue you and bring you to the surface, but no one wants to be unresponsive underwater. So, the working phase of the dive now for most agencies is 1.4 atmospheres absolute. And during the resting phase of the dive, in the shallow water, it does allow you to go up to 1.6 ATA. Now, the final thing I'll say about that, some divers will say they've been diving 1.6 for a long time, they haven't had a problem. One of the things that is important to understand is that divers use a lot more medications than they used to. And a lot of medications that divers use, in fact, the vast majority, have never been tested for their ramifications underwater. But we do know that a number of the common medications actually alter seizure threshold, so they can make you more prone to oxygen seizures. That's a good reason to stay away from a high PO2. Now, the final aspect that showed some incomplete understanding in the community would be the factors that affect decompression stress. And the two that I tend to focus on, because they are the big two outside of the dive profile, would be the physical activity and the thermal status. Physical activity is easy. Divers should work as little as possible before the dive and during the descent and bottom phase. You should be at rest if you can be, so you minimize inert gas uptake. On the way up and during any stops or safety stops, you should be mildly exercising. So this is a very light exercise just to keep the blood flowing, to keep the gas being eliminated as efficiently as possible. But you have to be aware, a little exercise is good, but if you have high joint forces or high intensity exercise, you can promote bubble formation, and that we want to avoid. So finally, for exercise, the post-dive period, you should be exercising as little as possible. And now, as most divers know, they have to do some exercise just to get themselves out of the water. If you know you have to do substantial exercise post-dive, you should be considering that in your dive profile. So the final element is the thermal status. And there have now been a couple of studies, one a superb study that has shown the impact of thermal status over the course of the dive. To keep it pretty simple, if you're warm when you go down, you increase your blood flow to your peripheral tissues. That increases your uptake of inert gas. That would be undesirable. If you're cool or thermoneutral on the way down, you have less blood flow in your periphery, so less uptake of gas. That's the first part. When we're coming up from the dive, if you're cool or cold, you're vasoconstricted, you're not eliminating that gas from the periphery, you're effectively prolonging your state of high decompression stress. Alternatively, if you're mildly warm, you're going to promote circulation to your periphery and promote the elimination of inert gas. Divers have control over this. we have an increasing array of commercial products available to keep divers warm and comfortable. The problem is, if you prioritize comfort, it can compromise your safety. If you want to wear a suit that keeps you toasty warm, you're going down warm, you're maximizing your uptake. If that suit failed before you come up, you're going to be coming up cold, which is minimal elimination. That's your highest risk combination. Warm on the way down, cold on the way up. So before you think about active heating systems, you have to really consider the ramifications on your decompression safety. Well, that's it for the highlights of the knowledge gaps that we found in the diving community in our 2018 survey. Thank you very much.